Good evening. We have some visitors from New Mexico tonight. Gotcha. Glad y'all got back safe and sound. We want this evening to just make a few observations about what we discussed this morning. You recall that we had examined the process by what goes through the mind of people when they're on the road to having a debased mind, and the characteristics that accompany such debasement, and that our society is full of these kinds of debasements. And what is it our role as Christians to be in regards to these matters? First of all, Paul talks in terms of what he says in Romans 1 as being part of the gospel. The gospel is good news. It is the good news that Jesus Christ lived, died, was crucified for our sins, was buried, rose on the third day, and lives again at the right hand of God. And he appeared before many witnesses before he returned. And based upon that event, based upon that power that was given to him, he said that all power, all authority has been given to me on heaven and in earth. Based upon that power, he has proclaimed salvation to all the land. As the Old Testament put it, proclaiming liberty throughout all the land. And the gospel is not designed to enslave people, it is designed to free people from the shackles and the death of sin itself. But on our road to helping people understand the good news, their minds are so clouded that they think that we are somehow judging them, that we are somehow opposing them, that we're somehow wanting to take their freedom away. And so we want to observe some things based upon the text that we read just a few minutes ago in Luke 18. So we're going to ask you to turn back to Luke 18 just briefly for just a few short minutes to observe some things there. Luke 18, 10 to 14 is the passage, or 9 to 14 that we read. Before we examine what Jesus had to say in this passage, we want to just make a couple of observations about dialogue with those who are in opposition to God's marriage plan for various reasons. And one of the most important things as Christians we need to understand is the fact that it's not who's right, it's what's right. If you stop to think about all the discussions and the arguments that you see on television, it's all about who's right. Who can get the one extra gotcha over the other person? It's almost like a verbal combat. And we succumb to this idea far too often where we're in discussions with matters of morality with our friends and neighbors and relatives. We need to remember it's not about the who, it's about the what. It is also about what is the standard. We talked about normative and deviant this morning. When we discuss these matters with other people, if we cannot agree that the Bible is the standard on which we are to make moral decisions, then we really have a waste of time on our hands if we're going to engage in further discussion. We have to understand. We have to put ourselves in the place of our adversary. When we are talking to someone in the world who's wrapped up in any kind of immorality, be that fornication, be that adultery, be that homosexuality, we're talking to somebody who's delusional, spiritually speaking. Someone who is in the spiritual darkness. People who have a debased mind and have no clue about where they are or what the relationship with God is. And so we have to take the mindset of Jesus Christ that he had on the cross. For clearly the most delusional act ever committed in the history of mankind, from beginning to end, was that mankind murdered the Son of God. If you want to define delusional, that is it. But what was his mindset on the cross? And that was clearly one of forgiveness. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And that is the mindset that we must have when we are discussing matters of morality with those who are of a debased mind. They are out of their mind, spiritually speaking. And we need to be gentle and kind and understanding, not with their sin, but with their soul. Their soul is in peril and in danger. And if we say or do the wrong thing, they may be lost forever. So we must understand that it's not about who's right, it's about what's right. We must understand that it's not my standard or your standard, but what is God's standard? What is God's normative standard of morality? And as we observe both from the Garden of Eden and in Matthew 19, the standard is set by God. That marriage and sex within marriage is the only normative standard by which we can go by. And when we say we, we're talking about everyone. Everyone in the world, whether they're Christian or not, are under God's law of marriage. And that is one man with one woman for life. Exclusive. Why? Because it is God who makes a marriage. It is not man or woman or any other third party. God brings a man and a woman together in holy matrimony. And as Jesus observed, let no man rend asunder what God has joined together. Now, we wanted to mention Luke 18 because it's illustrative of our mindset that we need to have when we are engaging those who are caught up in the kinds of gross immorality that we have in our society. Because it is a huge temptation. It is a huge temptation to become prideful and define ourselves by what we do not do that others may do. I'm reminded of a passage in the Screwtape Letters that was written some years ago by C.S. Lewis. And Screwtape is a demon that is sent by a head demon to go and tempt Christians and pull them out of Christianity and back into the world. And Screwtape has a client that he's losing ground with. And he goes to his mentor in hell and essentially says, Master, I'm losing ground with the Christian. Despite my best efforts, he is becoming more humble all the time. And the demon master simply tells Screwtape, well, make sure he becomes proud of his humility. And it's very, very, very difficult for us not to be prideful and define ourselves by what we don't do. And it's very easy for us to sit here tonight or at home when we're visiting with family and friends or wherever it might be, and look down our nose upon the fornicator or the adulterer or the homosexual, and essentially say in our mind, whether we verbalize it or not, God, I thank you, I'm not like one of these. And that is what Jesus is teaching us in this passage that we read just a moment ago. Because Satan is obsessed with getting you and I to compare ourselves with each other. Because if he can do that, he can convince us all that we're justified without the blood of Christ. Why? Because I'm better than my neighbor, and therefore I'm going to heaven, and he's not. And I thank God that I'm not my neighbor. The ironic thing is that the two neighbors are thinking the same thing about each other. Everyone loses, no one wins. And this idea of comparing ourselves to each other and not comparing ourselves to Christ is a very, very dangerous thing. I remember my mother would often say to me when I would rear up in pride about some matter or another and point out some weakness in another person, she would always remind me, she would say, Russell, there but for the grace of God goes I. You know, none of us are who we are except by the grace and the mercy of Jesus Christ. We are not predestined to be one way or the other. The gospel was made available to us, and by the mercy and grace of Jesus Christ, those of us here accepted and obeyed that gospel. But we didn't have to, but we did. And if it wasn't for the atoning death of Jesus Christ, none of us would have that opportunity, and none of us are any better or any worse than anyone else. Paul says on many occasions, in many ways, especially in Romans, we've all sinned. We've all fallen short of the glory of God. We can, none of us, before God, boast that we are better than anyone else. In fact, in the book of Romans, Paul uses the illustration about Abraham. He says, if anybody has reason to boast, it would be Abraham, but not before God. Abraham did good things, but those good things didn't save him. God saved him. And so God will save those who have been true to their marriage vows, and He'll save people who weren't. He'll save all kinds of immoral people, even adulterers and homosexuals. Because Paul told the Corinthians, such were, past tense, some of you. And if we go back briefly to the Romans 1 passage that we looked at this morning, these people who Paul defines as being of a debased mind, not only were they homosexuals, men and women both, they were filled with all manner of sin as well. Some sins that we wouldn't really worry much about. Some sins in this list we even are proud of and credit each other with great wisdom if we can use them, especially in a business setting. What are some of these characteristics? Unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice, envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness, gossip, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughtiness, boastings, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolishness, faithlessness, heartlessness, ruthlessness. In these days, many of these things are considered resume enhancers in the business world. But Jesus wants to remind us that justification comes from humility. It comes from a contrite and broken heart before God of whatever it is sin that we have, and an understanding that our neighbor, though he may be guilty of a heinous sin, is no better or worse before God than you and I, because Jesus died for us all. And so tonight, as we go in close of another Lord's Day, preparing for another day in the world tomorrow, let us remember who we are. We're sinners saved despite of our sins, just like anybody else. But Jesus has given us not only salvation, but He's given us the example, and He's given us the order to be salt and light in the world. And the times are screaming a need for salt and light like no other time in the history of our great country than right now. If you're here tonight and you need to make things right with God in whatever way, won't you come while we stand and sing to encourage you right now?
Oh, and